Robby, what's on your radar?
Well, when celebrities, top political leaders, and media elites gathered on Saturday night for the first White House Correspondents Dinner in 3 years, Anthony Fauci was not among them. The government's top COVID-19 advisor had opted not to attend, citing, quote, "my individual assessment of my personal risk of contracting the disease." While Fauci did not attend the dinner itself, he was photographed at a pre-party, an indoor and outdoor Saturday brunch. Now, Fauci is certainly free to make whatever decision he thinks is best for him in the post-vaccination landscape as COVID-19 becomes a milder and milder illness for the overwhelming majority of healthy, vaccinated people who catch it. Risk assessment absolutely rests with the individual. Much of the public frustration with Dr. Fauci and government health officials like him is that for far too long, they insisted risk assessment be calculated by federal health bureaucrats for the collective rather than the individual. Disastrously, these bureaucrats were often far less willing than the general public to countenance any risk whatsoever. They also evinced misplaced priorities. Mask requirements for school children remained in place even as governments relaxed most other restrictions, despite COVID-19 posing less risk to kids and teenagers than any other cohort. Now, the U.S. is swiftly, thank God, moving away from this norm, the norm of needing permission from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and letting people work out for themselves how they feel about the risk of catching COVID-19 as if it were any other illness. That's a relief. And any effort to go back to the old norm should be met with maximal resistance. All that said, Fauci's personal risk assessment is not beyond criticism, given that he clearly sees himself as a model of good public health behavior and has remained a steadfast scold about holiday parties and other events. So skipping the White House Correspondents' Dinner is well in keeping with his stated coronavirus caution. But was the brunch all that much safer? Now, the brunch was partly outdoors, fine, but there were indoor components as well, as far as I could tell. Moreover, most attendants were in close proximity and unmasked, Fauci included. A lot of drinking and talking and laughing and making merry, the kinds of things that actually do spread COVID. Now, Fauci also attended the annual Gridiron Dinner less than a month ago, which did turn out to be a super spreader event, though Fauci evidently avoided the virus. Now, Fauci is all over the place, both literally attending parties and figuratively in terms of his basic stance on whether the pandemic is over. Rising Fridays co-hosts Emily Jashinsky and Ryan Grimm highlighted this confusion last week.
Now, Dr. Fauci walked back comments that he made where he said the U.S. is no longer in the pandemic phase. He told NPR, quote, "I want to clarify one thing. I probably should have said the acute component of the pandemic phase, and I understand how that can lead to some misinterpretation. I was talking about the acute fomenting phase, and everyone agrees we're not there. We're not getting 900,000 new infections a day." And he goes on to say, "Is the pandemic still here? Absolutely." So just to refresh your memory, here's Fauci's earlier statement about the pandemic being over.
We are at a low level right now. So if you're saying, are we out of the pandemic phase in this country? We are. What we hope to do, I don't believe, and I've spoken about this widely, we're not going to eradicate this virus. If we can keep that level very low and intermittently vaccinate people, and I don't know how often that would have to be, Judy. That might be every year, that might be longer, in order to keep that level low. But right now, we are not in the pandemic phase in this country.
Again, I don't care if Fauci follows inconsistent or unclear standards. A lot of people have followed inconsistent or unclear personal standards throughout the pandemic. But let's keep in mind that he was the paramount standard setter for all Americans, mandatory, from March 2019 until just a few weeks ago. One should be forgiven for subjecting his assessment to greater scrutiny. If you're hobnobbing with a large number of social people, you run some risk of catching COVID. That's as true for brunch as it is for dinner. So I just don't know what to do with this guy. Says, no, it says the pandemic's over, then says, well, it didn't quite mean that it's over, goes to the Gridiron Dinner, which is a super spreader event, says he's not going to go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner because it's too risky, but goes to the brunch with a bunch of people before. None of that makes any sense. Which, again, I don't care what he does, but he's the guy who is determining what everyone is allowed to do, or whose recommendations for what you should be allowed to do were taken as gospel by government policymakers at every level, state, local, and national. And he's no better at picking this stuff than anybody else, or doesn't make any more sense than anybody else, which really undermines if I had any confidence left in government health officials, it would certainly be further undermined, but I don't. So I guess it's just still at zero.
Yeah, it's what the kids, I believe, call a weird flex to make so much of not going to the dinner. It does feel like whether or not he was doing it, that the liberal media broadly was trying to make some kind of case for, Fauci's so safe, Fauci's not going to this dinner, which is a little inconvenient, mind you, for everyone else at the dinner, right? The implications of holding him up, right, as an exemplar of safety really throws everybody else, including the President of the United States, under the bus. But that all seems to be wasted with him showing up with all of these pictures with his arm around Don Lemon and everybody else at this brunch, which is an indoor and outdoor event. You can make a case for, well, everyone had to get PCR tests going into these events, and so it was generally safe. But that doesn't distinguish what the difference between the brunch
right.
and the dinner, which a lot was made of, that he wasn't going to attend. What's the difference there?
Yeah, I actually think there's a little bit of a difference between the brunch and the dinner. I do think that being outdoors is safer than being indoors. And if the brunch is kind of indoor-outdoor and they've got the indoors, the doors wide open and fresh air coming in and there's a lot of ventilation, there might make some difference there. So I can understand a person assessing the situation and their personal risk and saying, okay, I'll go to an outdoor brunch and kind of remain mostly outdoors versus going into an indoor dinner where the doors are closed and there's not much ventilation. I can understand that, and that's fine. I'm with you, Robby, on this where, at this point it should be, and it should have been for me all along, individual assessment, individual risk, assess it, figure out where you're at, and then make decisions based on that. From what we know about this virus, we know that it is largely, for the vast majority of young people, not harmful. That is what we've known and even thought was amazing in the beginning of the pandemic, thinking, wow, thank goodness the children are being spared by this. But for whatever reason, those knowns, those scientific knowns have not mattered. And even today, still children are being masked in schools. I was even just in Texas this last weekend, surprising to find out that kids in Texas are still wearing masks. I thought for sure, okay, maybe here in California, I can understand, California, but Texas. So one thing that I really would like to see going forward with Fauci is more consistency in guiding the local health officials. So you've got Fauci now saying pandemic over, not over, kind of over, think so, it's over. I'm going to assess my personal risk. But then on the local level, that message doesn't seem to be going down the pipeline. And you've got all these local officials still regulating and mandating a variety of things for people. And I thought, especially for the Democratic Party that's saying we're the party of science, we're following the lead, we're following Fauci. Why are they not then following Fauci at this point? And why is Fauci not being more aggressive about, I'm the leader here? He's the one who says he's science, right? And that he's the end all be all. So if that's the case, and he doesn't even have to abide by the courts. If that's the case, why is he not giving more directives to the local authorities and saying, at this point, we should be assessing personal individual risk. We know that the levels are as low as they've ever been. Children are not at risk. Like, maybe it's time to actually start exiting the pandemic. I don't see when it's going to end, though, because he's not saying any of this.
Right. And what happens when, let's say, the White House Correspondents Dinner turns out to have been some kind of super spreader event? Could be the case that cases rise a little bit in D.C. as a direct result of that. The overwhelming likelihood is that deaths and hospitalizations, even if cases rise, deaths and hospitalizations probably won't. They really haven't in D.C. if you look at the numbers for the last 10 months or so. But cases might rise a little bit, and then will the policymakers in D.C., will Muriel Bowser look at her social calendar, say, oh yeah, I don't have anything this weekend, so we can bring back the mask mandate, as she has essentially done in the past. So then it will be the case that these partying celebrities, media figures, and government officials, they are happy, they can party when it's convenient for them, they can socialize when it's convenient for them, and then still they feel they want to defend the right to inflict mask mandates, other restrictions on people whenever they feel like it. So it's just, so the people are powerless because they're at the mercy of these officials who will do whatever they want when they feel like doing it, and then say, okay, now we're telling you what to do again.
Yeah, I think the people who've pointed out that there were all of these COVID measures that attendees had to take into account, testing and the like. But the same wasn't true for the people who were working the event, who of course remained masked, is a really perfect example of the inconsistency in the way that these kind of policies are applied and who actually has to be subjected to them. And in the pictures of Fauci at the brunch event, he seems to be very clearly inside and no one around him seems to be masked. I saw some of the pictures from the event itself that evening, and some people did obviously make the choice to remain masked through most, if not all, of the evening. And so you're seeing people manage their personal choices differently, which is fair enough. But there was one group of people who's able to do that, the attendees of the event, and another group of people who absolutely is not, the people who are actually working.
That's a good point. I'm so sick of seeing masked service people. I mean, if they want to wear masks, that's fine. But I feel like we're starting to create this underclass or this secondary class of people who can't even be seen or be viewed. That is there's something about it that's disturbing to me, and I think it disturbs a lot of people. But anyway, Dr. Trita Parsi will join us next to discuss the pivot in U.S. strategy in the war on Ukraine. Stick with us for that.